Good evening, everyone. Good you're here again for the fourth session in this course. And tonight we're looking at the partition of Irish Unionists. Now, partition was a far-reaching event because it was not only the partition of Ireland, it was the partition of the province of Ulster. And it was also the partition of Irish Unionists and the partition of Irish nationalists. And the latter meant that 1/3 of the population of the new Northern Ireland was beached on the wrong side of the border, not where they wanted to be, with the partition imposed on them. And the partition of Irish nationalists is the story that we will try to explore next week. But the focus now is on the partition of Irish Unionists, that other minority left stranded in a sea of Irish nationalism and Catholicism. The Irish Unionists were largely Irish Protestants, and now partition had left this minority where they did not want to be, and with the partition that was imposed on them. And in looking at the partition of Irish Unionists, we will look from a number of angles and see how partition affected people and how partition created minorities. We will look at the role of the Church of Ireland bishops in all of this, the population movement or displacement of Irish Protestants, and the impact of partition on the identity of those Irish Unionists or Protestants. So let's look first of all at how partition created minorities. We've already said the partition of Ireland was also the partition of Ulster. And that meant that not only was a province partitioned, but this new Northern Ireland was not Ulster and was never Ulster, nor is it the province. And its people are not the people of Ulster, except in the sense that they are a people of a 9-county province of Ulster that was partitioned in 1920. Now, some of this was humorously stated in 1998 when Ulster Rugby won the European Championship in a final that was played in Dublin. 2 banners were draped over the old Lansdowne Road stand saying, "Cavan also supports Ulster." Well, Ulster Rugby, as rugby in the rest of Ireland, is organised on a 4 provinces basis. And Ulster Rugby is the 9-county province, and Cavan was making that point in 1998. Some might wonder if the persistence of this confusion of Northern Ireland as Ulster is perhaps on the part of some an attempt to deny that in 1920 the northeastern Unionists betrayed the Protestants of Cavan and Monaghan and Donegal. Well, that in itself might be denied, but partition turned individuals and communities into minorities just because of where they were born or lived. It divided people from their co-religionists and from their fellow unionist or nationalist citizens. And as each political or partition political entity set about nation building, the respective minorities were excluded. And those minorities became for the respective states a bad conscience or an irritating embarrassment. For the British, the minorities were a nuisance or a threat to the workability of partition. And the new minorities were left fearful and bewildered. What of their freedom? Where did loyalty lie? The choice was taken from them. Who were these Irish Unionists beached now in the Free State? The son of the first Irish Unionist leader, Colonel Edward Saunderson from Cavan, sounded despairing in December 1921 when he declared, "Now I have no country." Well, Irish Unionism was all Ireland, it's important to remember that, and was opposed to home rule for any part of Ireland. It was imperialistic, wanting Ireland to stay within the United Kingdom and the Empire. And the partition of Irish Unionism began, I suppose, in 1905, when the Ulster Unionist Council was formed. And this marked the Ulsterisation of the Irish problem. Edward Carson was an Irish Unionist, and he never ceased to be an Irish Unionist, which explains, I think, his bitter disillusionment at the partition of Ireland and the granting of a Home Rule Parliament to Northern Ireland. Carson never wanted that. But he was pulled into the Ulster question and the Ulsterisation of the problem, and could, in the end, do nothing about it. But had Carson created a militant monster? In 1919, a delegation from Donegal came to Belfast to see Carson. They were deeply worried that partition would become a reality and Donegal would be left high and dry. And after discussion, Carson told them, "Sorry, you're on your own now." And when the Presbyterian minister in that Donegal delegation returned to his manse in Malin, he took a signed copy of the 1912 Ulster Covenant and he tore it in two, framed the torn document, and hung it above his study mantelpiece. And for him, for the rest of his life, it was a symbol of a broken covenant. I've had some experiences working in East Donegal, where there is a relatively strong Protestant community, quite a few Orangemen. Not all by any means, but some are rather angry people, and it's an intergenerational anger. They somehow know and feel that they are on the wrong side of the border, and while not articulated, the anger goes back to people like Carson in 1920. And these Irish Unionists and their ancestors have been described, as have those of Monaghan and Cavan, as Carson's betrayed children. It was not just the three Ulster County Irish Unionists. There were the Irish Unionists scattered throughout the rest of the new Free State, as far south as Lord Middleton and East Cork, and those Irish Unionists in West Cork. Partition had made them a minority, a more isolated community than ever before. They were a beached community, even though in many cases they were a privileged community. Members of the Church of Ireland made up 75% of the Protestants in the Free State. Of the 35,500 Presbyterians, 65% were in the border counties. Methodists at 10,500 were generally in pockets in Dublin, Cork, West Cork, and the Midlands. And while there was Protestant poverty, largely found in parts of Dublin, many of these Protestants were well off. In 1916, the 7% Protestant population of Cork owned 60% of the city's cars. In the Free State, some 53% of them were senior bank officials, 46% chartered accountants, 39% barristers, 38% solicitors, 22% medical doctors, 15% civil servants, 10% teachers. And in rural areas in 14 counties, Protestants owned over 1/3 of the larger farms. And in 1926, they owned half the farms in Carlow, Longford, Wicklow, Cavan, and Monaghan. And these Protestants were 10% of the total population. Partition had forced them to be a minority, beached on the wrong side of a border, with an identity crisis, not belonging and unsure of their place and their role in a new nationalist Catholic state. We look at a moving minority. Both new states saw a decline in their minority communities during and after partition. There was a census in 1911, and because of serious violence, the next census was not held until 1926. In 1911, there were 300,000 Southern Protestants. Roughly 100,000 left the Free State. Now, there is a narrative that simply says they were all forced to leave, but a more in-depth analysis shows more complex reasons for such a decline in the Protestant population. At partition, there was a post-settlement withdrawal of British personnel and their families. Some 40,000 British soldiers, civil servants, lawyers, and other servants of the Crown returned permanently to Britain. There had been a second Methodist church in Cork City. It was really a garrison church located in a road called Military Road in Cork. And after 1922, it ceased to be a Methodist church. It is now a Catholic church. The Methodist chapel in Clonmel closed for similar reasons and later became a car showroom. More than 1/3 of the Protestant decline was British personnel returning home after partition. And the pattern of Protestant decline began, in fact, after the famine in the 1840s, and the First World War then reduced the Protestant population further. Church of Ireland buildings, many of them in the south, have First World War memorials, which suggest a remarkably close connection between the Church of Ireland and World War I. Many members of the Church of Ireland joined the British Army, and many died in World War I battles. In the independent Ireland, commemoration of World War I dead eventually fell into decline, except in the Church of Ireland, where Remembrance Day in the church. I think for a moment I probably disappeared, but I'm back again, I think. We were saying that Remembrance Day remained a highly symbolic event in the church calendar, Church of Ireland calendar, with special services and processions. And the Atlas of the Irish Revolution says that this continued as a distinctive feature of Protestant culture and identity. The war, therefore, accounted for some of the loss of Protestants in the South. Irish landlordism was in a slow decline since the introduction of land reform in the late 19th century and was accelerated by events of 1919-1923. After the 1923 Land Act, landlords were forced to sell up. In County Clare alone, 188 Clare estates were taken over through compulsory purchase. The Atlas of Irish Revolution again. The Irish Free State had been one of the first European societies to largely dissolve its landed gentry, which led to the departure of many, but not all, of the Protestant community's finer leadership cadre. But the process was well underway prior to 1920. Big house owners were targeted between 1919 and 1920 by the IRA, looking often for arms. The big houses were also potential billets for Crown forces, and many were burned in 1921 as reprisals for attack on Republican households. During the War of Independence and the Civil War, 1919-1923, almost 300 big houses were burned down. And occupants of these big houses, with their servants, took flight for England. Southern Protestants within the Irish establishment were particular targets for Republican revolutionaries. These were supporters of the Crown forces, resident magistrates, lieutenants, deputy lieutenants who upheld the old order and refused to resign. They were intimidated, subject to arson attacks, and in some cases murder. A number of these people left for England. And there was also a minority of Protestant civilians who, rightly or wrongly, were suspected of providing information to the Crown forces. The IRA assassinated many of them. Some Protestant churches were attacked in counties Clare, Limerick and Galway. On the 26th of June 1922, a Church of Ireland church in Donegal was attacked with the congregation inside. They were unhurt, but nearly all the windows were smashed. But the worst atrocity against civilian Protestants was in West Cork, in the Bandon Valley at the end of April 1922, when 13 Protestants were shot dead in 2 nights, and many more left injured. In Dunmanway, where I lived for 4 years in the early 1970s, In 1922 in Dunmanway, 3 people were shot dead and 4 injured. James Buttermer was the octogenarian who had his teeth and brains blown out, and his grave and headstone are in the churchyard of the now former Methodist Church in Dunmanway. The cause of his death is not inscribed on the headstone. Irish nationalism has always denied any sectarianism in its makeup, and any suggestion that these West Cork killings were sectarian usually hits a rather raw nerve. The killings of Protestants in Culacrease and County Offaly in 1921 has been justified by Republicans by reference to their ancestors as being Cromwellian settlers. The Bandon Valley killings are thought to be a reprisal for the killing of an IRA officer by a Protestant household trying to defend itself from an attack during an IRA night raid. But the Cork and West Cork killings in general are thought to be reprisals for the killings of Catholics in Belfast. It is difficult to deny the sectarianism of both killing fields in Cork and Belfast. And it's also rather difficult not to see sectarianism behind the burning of 300 big houses. Protestants did take flight and left Ireland, but there are complex reasons behind the decline of 1/3 of the Protestant population in the Free State. Some 2,117 Protestants from Leitrim, Cavan and Sligo moved across the border and settled permanently in Northern Ireland. There were economic factors. Monaghan's Protestant population fell by over 25% in 3 years. Robert Lynch, the historian, puts it this way: hundreds of Protestant businessmen, having already suffered 2 years of intimidation and boycott, were forced to flee. Indeed, of the 45 Protestant families who left urban border areas of County Monaghan at the height of the violence in the spring of 1922, over 3/4 of them were businessmen and their families. I want to stop there, and that we can have an open general discussion for a while. But let's go on and look at a couple of other angles when we try to look at the experience of the partition of Irish Unionists. And we've been talking about the church towards the end of the last discussion, and how a generation of young people have largely moved off from those institutional forms of religion. But there was a remarkable role being played, and a very significant role being played 100 years ago in all of this by the Church of Ireland bishops. And Brian Walker, Professor Emeritus of Irish Studies at Queen's University, has very helpfully analysed reports and episcopal speeches at Church of Ireland synods from 1919 to 1923. Now, given that the Church of Ireland membership accounted for 75% of the Protestant population in the new Free State, their reports and their speeches provide crucial insight into the situation of a beached minority. In May 1917, 3 Church of Ireland bishops, Tuam, Ossory and Killaloe, signed, together with 17 Catholic bishops, an anti-partition declaration. Remarkable, you might say. And the 3 Church of Ireland bishops, Tuam, Ossory and Killaloe, were Unionists, but they were Irish Unionists. And Irish Unionists were against partition. And immediately, the 5 bishops from the northeast of Ireland responded by saying that Home Rule would be disastrous for Ireland and for the Empire, and there can be, they said, no Home Rule without the exclusion of Ulster. The Southern clergy then complained that many Protestants in the other provinces objected to being identified with Northern resistance. Southern clergy were Home Rulers. A former vice president of the Methodist Church and principal at that time of Wesley College, Dublin, William Crawford, criticised Ulster Unionists for trying to impose their wishes on the majority population of the country. So Protestant relationships were tense running up to partition. The 5 northern bishops of the Church of Ireland supported partition, and not surprisingly, Archbishop Darcy and Methodist William Crawford were calling at the same time for conciliation and Irish Protestants to show goodwill, not least to each other. In 1921, the new Archbishop of Dublin, Gregg, was grateful for a truce from bloodshed and was having to assert that, quote, "We are as truly Irish as our many. Here is our home, and we have every right to be here." And in a sermon in 1921, as treaty negotiations were taking place in London, Archbishop Gregg said, we may not like the facts. Many of us had no desire for a change of our constitution. It concerns us all to offer the Irish Free State, as shortly to be constituted, our loyalty and goodwill. On May the 9th, 1922, the General Synod of the Church of Ireland met, and the new Primate, Archbishop Darcy, reflected on the state of the country. Despite successive blunders by British government, he was still a firm believer in the principles of unionism. However, they had to prepare to meet a new order in the country. And he referred to the Bandon Valley killings, noting that all the victims were Protestant, and warned, nothing more awful could happen than that the political strife in the country should become a war of religion. So the Church of Ireland bishops were Unionists, the 5 northern for partition, and the southern bishops Unionists who were against. And those in the south were having to voice the suffering of a Protestant people, the killings, the burnings, the decline in membership as people left the country. And yet they were also in the south trying to help their people cope with change and commit to their new country and somehow find their place within it. The bishops were, in fact, in a highly charged pastoral situation. And in 1923, Bishop John Orr addressed his diocesan synod at Tuam. "We," he said, "of the Church of Ireland love our country. We would not be true members of the Church of Ireland if we did not. We are the Church of the whole, and not a part of Ireland. And no power on earth will ever please God, partition our church, whatever it may do with our country." And all of the churches, Catholic and Protestant, refused to have their churches partitioned 100 years ago. They remained, and they have remained, All Ireland churches. That brings us to partition and Protestant identity. Now, partition was responsible for hundreds of deaths and injuries. Thousands were displaced from homes, mainly Catholics in the north and Protestants in the south. Irish Unionists were beached on the wrong side of the border. Those in the 3 Ulster counties of Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal, and perhaps also in Leitrim and Sligo, feeling betrayed by Northern Unionists. I think it's worth noting at this stage that those Unionists, those Irish Unionists in Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal, produced a pamphlet during these years, which they, as led up to partition, which they sent to the Ulster Unionist Council. And they set out with a very detailed list of statistics showing that in a 9-county partition, that's what it was going to be. There would not be a Protestant difficulty. The majority was still going to be considerably Protestant, they showed. But they ended their pamphlet, and it's a lengthy enough pamphlet and it's worth reading. They ended their pamphlet by saying, "We appeal to our fellow Unionists in the 6 counties not to desert us and not to violate their covenant when they can take us in with perfect safety to themselves. So there is a lot of feeling there. And for all the political and economic ramifications of partition, there were nevertheless also many organisations and groups which continued as though partition had not happened. The Catholic Church and the Protestant churches remained All-Ireland bodies. Most trade unions did the same, and most sports organisations. Only one sport divided along partitionist lines, and that was soccer, but soccer split for internal political reasons and not because of the partition of Ireland. Many other bodies refused to be split by partition, and much of this actually remains. But those Irish Unionists were beached on the wrong side of the border, and they were being forced to struggle with identity. They were now different from the self-described Ulster Unionists. It took a generation, perhaps, for Irish Unionists and Protestants to feel that they were part of a new country and to identify with its symbols and its emblems. It may well have been, as we said earlier, into the 1930s before Irish Protestants felt that they belonged. They had been 10% of the population in 1911. By 1926, Protestants were 7% of the population. And yet, they still produced 40% of the lawyers, over 50% of the bankers, and over a quarter of large farms were still Protestant-owned. By the 1930s, though, they were not a political force in their own right. Irish Unionism had ceased to be. But they still had their own schools and clubs and societies, and they patronised Protestant banks and businesses. And the Irish Times was the Protestant newspaper, as Ferreter said, easing the Unionists into a tolerance, albeit often begrudgingly, of a new Ireland. In 1922, the second Dáil had a number of Protestant TDs, though they became fewer by the late 1930s. One of the most active was Jasper Wolf, a Methodist from Skibbereen in West Cork, a pro-treaty supporter, which led to 3 death threats on his life. Wolf sat in the Dáil as an independent and was a constant thorn in the flesh of De Valera. And the Free State Constitution of 1922 did not provide specific safeguards for the Protestant community. Neither were there specific safeguards or rights enshrined for the nationalist community in the north, a flaw and failing of the settlement in 1920. But the Free State Constitution, whilst it did not provide specific safeguards for the Protestant community, in December 1922, a large number of Protestants and former Unionists, more than 20 of them, mostly members of the Church of Ireland, were nominated by the government or elected to the new Irish Senate. Now, that was a significant gesture by the Free State government. And those Protestant senators included Lord Middleton and W.B. Yeats. The fragility of Protestant identity was somewhat exposed in 1948 when the Taoiseach John A. Costello announced in September that he intended to repeal the 1936 External Relations Act and declare the Free State a republic. That broke the last constitutional link with the United Kingdom. It also meant withdrawal from the Commonwealth of Nations. And in the Senate, a member of the Church of Ireland, a Quaker and a Presbyterian supported this constitutional move, but a Presbyterian and 2 members of the Church of Ireland opposed it. The withdrawal of the proposed republic from the Commonwealth of Nations threw the Church of Ireland into turmoil, and an internal battle raged from 1948 to 1950 over what became known as the State Prayers controversy. Now, the State Prayers were an intrinsic part of Anglican liturgy since the 16th century. The Book of Common Prayer always had prayers for the state and the monarch. The Republic of Ireland came into being on the 18th of April, 1949, 3 weeks before the General Synod of the Church of Ireland met. The Archbishop of Armagh, John Gregg, and the Archbishop of Dublin, Arthur Barton, had prepared temporary prayers for youth in southern churches. There was no mention of the monarch in these prayers. The prayers were to be adopted permanently by the Synod of May 1949. Now, within the Southern Church of Ireland membership, the feeling was mixed. Some were all for the new prayers. Some couldn't care less. Some were sorry that the king was not mentioned, but accepted the change. And others bitterly opposed the prayers and began a battle to retain prayers for the monarch. A well-organised crusade was organised by a Hugh Maud, working through the media and every structure of the church. And the crusade raged until the General Synod of 1950, when a form of words was produced that was felt could satisfy and would satisfy members of the Church of Ireland North and South. Bishop Boyd of Derry and Raphoe was concerned that wording would allow Southerners to pray for the king without appearing disloyal to the Republic. And so the monarch was referred to as King George VI, not as our king or our sovereign. It had been a major controversy. Miriam Moffat puts it this way: the significance of the state prayers episode is that it provides a snapshot of Protestant conceptions of identity some 30 years after the establishment of the Irish Free State. When it was founded in 1922, most of the Protestant population of the island favoured the retention of British rule. Well, partition was confusing. And if the British thought it would set up two homogeneous states, they were quickly disabused with that idea. It had created two minorities. Irish Unionists, again, were largely Irish Protestants. And now partition had left this minority where they did not want to be, and with a partition imposed upon them. There is another story, and we don't have time to look at it, but it's a story of those Protestants in the South, largely, not exclusively, who were actually Irish Republicans and active Irish Republicans. 90 have been identified, 60 men, 30 women. And perhaps just to mention three in passing. Dr. Kathleen Lynn was a devout member of the Church of Ireland, regular communicant, member of the IRA, actively involved, imprisoned in 1918, but released because of the flu pandemic, and every medic available was needed, and she was a doctor. The other was Alice Milligan, a Methodist from Omagh, who was involved heavily in the Irish Republican tradition, never stopped being a Methodist. When she was back in Omagh and dying at the end of her life, dying in poverty, in fact, the Methodist minister in Omagh visited her, pastoral care. His name at the time was the Reverend Robert England. And the story goes that when he called to see her on one occasion, this feisty, small little woman, and she was very small, found the strength somewhere to sit up in bed and say, "I'm not having my funeral conducted by a man called England." So the other was Sean Nestor. And Sean Nestor was a Methodist born in Carrickfergus, an Irish Republican, not involved in the Easter Rising, but entered into government, the new government diplomatic service in the South. And Sean Nestor eventually became the Secretary General of the League of Nations, the top position. What today we recognize as the Secretary General of the United Nations. Nestor had a remarkable career. I'm not sure he has been recognized adequately in Ireland. He certainly has had no recognition, to the best of my knowledge, in the Irish Methodist Church. But there were Protestants who were active Republicans, as well as those who were Irish Unionists, whatever they became after partition and settled into a new state. Okay, we need to go, maybe we'd go for 15 minutes to groups and look again at the question, what did the partition do for us? But another question that you might want to consider, how have we lived with partition?